Well, welcome everyone to the Ex Umbris podcast. I am Scholarch McLarney. With me, we have a special guest today. We also have
Schoolman, Fawcett. We are teachers at the world's only online Chesterton Academy, Chesterton Academy of St. Isidore Learning Center. And this podcast is Classical Catholic Education in podcast form. So we are a Chesterton Academy. It's probably widely known that, the Chesterton Academy is associated with the Chesterton Society, the Gilbert Magazine they produce, and that Chesterton himself was a detective story writer. And so for a long time, I've wanted to talk about detective stories in the light of classical education and at Chesterton. And it just so happens that I found the best guy maybe in the world for that topic. My fellow devotee of solar ponds, Sherlock Holmes, and all things mysterious, Dr. Chris Chan, who we were very fortunate to have on with us today. I guess I would summarize Chris by saying he's a historian from Wisconsin. He's a contributing editor, I think, to Gilbert Magazine, and a mystery novelist and storyteller of his own. We've both written, for example, we both contributed stories to the Sherlock Holmes and Father Brown compilation that our superintendent enjoyed.
Okay.
So I guess a quick introduction to Dr. Chris Chan here. Chris, there's so much that could be said about you. Is there anything else you wanted to mention by way of introduction about yourself?
Hi. Well, first of all, I just want to say how I'm very grateful to be here. I don't know if I'm the best person in the world to talk about these. I think that's a little hyperbole, but I appreciate it. Just, I think, why don't we start talking? And I think any other introduction or background will come up in the natural conversation flow, I hope.
That's a insightful opening, I think. Fair enough. So, sure, fair enough. So. I will just give a bit of background, I guess, for this, which is that I met Chris, I guess you could say, because we're both members of a very niche society, the Parade Street Irregulars, which is dedicated to the study of solar ponds. Now, if you go back and watch our Halloween episode where I'm wearing a deerstalker, I say I'm not Sherlock Holmes, I'm solar ponds.
Yeah, okay, now remind our listeners the difference.
Okay. Well, basically, there was a Catholic writer in Wisconsin. It's not too far from where Chris is, in Sauk City, Wisconsin. And I think he was 19 years old in like the 20s. And he wrote to Arthur Conan Doyle saying, "Are you going to write any more Sherlock Holmes stories?" And Arthur Conan Doyle said no. Then this young Catholic author named August Derleth said, "Could I write some?" And Arthur Conan Doyle politely said no. So instead, he wrote about a detective named Solar Ponds and his sidekick, Dr. Parker, who live in an apartment on Parade Street. The housekeeper is Mrs. Johnson,
Okay.
and a Scotland Yard inspector comes and brings them cases to solve. And he basically wrote Sherlock Holmes stories that weren't called Sherlock Holmes.
So
That are set a little later. They're chronologically. The idea is that Solar Ponds is like a student of Sherlock Holmes, kind of carrying on his legacy.
Yes.
And I was always interested in this because, he's a Catholic writer writing what are considered some of the best Sherlock Holmes stories not written by Arthur Conan Doyle, even though they're not Sherlock Holmes stories. And he actually wrote more stories about solar ponds than Doyle wrote about Sherlock Holmes. So there's a famous, huge society dedicated to Sherlock Holmes called the Baker Street Irregulars. And then, so there's a Parade Street Irregulars dedicated to studying solar ponds.
Okay.
And I contributed a couple essays to their magazine, so I got to become a member. And Dr. Chris Chan was already a member, and I learned of him this way. And you have to take names from the books. When you become a member of the society, you take a name of one of the characters from Solar Ponds. And I wanted to be called Cardinal Hoffman, because there's one story where Solar Ponds defeats an evil villain who's infiltrated the Catholic Church and disguises as a cardinal.
No way.
And the Catholicism's very thick in that story.
Yeah.
So I wanted to be Cardinal Hoffman, but I found that this guy had already taken it.
Oh, okay.
So instead I took the name Teal Murchison, who's the name of a Catholic bookseller in another story.
Okay.
But so I knew there was another Catholic involved in the Parade Street society. So then I just kind of dug deeper and discovered, that he was also a Catholic, also on the autism spectrum, that a lot of points of synchronicity. So that was my introduction to Chris. And I mentioned all this by way of background of saying, as someone who knows Catholicism, studied a student of Chesterton and a student of the mystery story, where do you see synchronicities? Like, how do those line up, Christianity and the detective story as a genre?
Okay, yeah. So yeah, I guess our opening question then. Yeah, what are the connections between Christianity and the detective genre or the detective novel?
Yeah. I guess, because I feel like a lot of Christians are interested in detective stories and enjoy them. And I'm wondering if that's just a coincidence or if there's something about being Christian or Catholic that lends itself maybe to being interested in that story, the style of story.
Well, I think that, people are always talking about, what are the origins of the mystery story or the crime story? And I think that some people, there's this one book I read in high school in anthologies said that was trying to trace it and said that a lot of people claim that, the origins of the crime story begin with the story of Cain and Abel. And then other people say that's, maybe that's the first murder there. And people think that well, a lot of people don't want to start there. They say that's not really helpful for our purposes. But I think one of the other interesting points is that also in the Bible you have the rescue of Susanna, which is in the Apocrypha. That's in the Catholic Bible, but not in most other Protestant versions of it. And in that story, for anybody who's not familiar with it, there's a case where this woman, Susanna, is falsely accused of adultery, and she's about to be executed when someone comes to rescue and says, "Wait, I am innocent of this woman's death. I am innocent of this woman's death." And and he points out that her accusers are liars, and he demands that they be cross-examined. And by after a little bit of interrogation, he finds the discrepancies in their story, and it's able to prove that, and this is in the book of Daniel, how how they made up the story. So it's one of the first examples of basically how it's one of the first examples of how essentially not necessarily a legal drama, a courtroom drama in a way, of how that, and I found I think when you look at it, there's a lot of false information out there about saying how really detection didn't really come about till the Enlightenment, that no one really thought about investigating this way with police procedure. And they cite Vidocq and all these other, Robert Peel and all these other from 18th, 19th century figure building the actual detective story. But when you look back at history, there really were a lot of figures, not just in Europe, but all over the world, that did use detection methods long before that. Throughout China, I mean, what they call the Judge D mysteries have been, where you had a Chinese civil servant who would travel around and investigate stories. There really was a long tradition of investigation that, well, it had a whole lot that didn't by interrogating witnesses, and a classic Chinese forensic manual called that's often translated to the washing away of wrongs, that was basically one of the first forensic science manuals from centuries ago. And though I mean it would be very inaccurate today, it's a fascinating book on how they were able to figure out all these methods of trying to figure out wounds and how to solve them. And I think the case of the donation of Constantine, which is, for anyone who's not familiar with it, is this famous case where there was, again, a famous document that was purportedly gave the church dominion over certain areas, but it was an actual churchman who did the investigation to prove it was a forgery. And I think that's just it's often brought up of a case where, oh, this figure was bringing up something for the undarkened church, but no, it wasn't that. When you look at it with fresh eyes, it's a story where you have essentially an official investigator digging through historical research and running down proof to figure out the truth about whether something is real or a forgery. And I think that there's a long history, because from everything from Thomas Aquinas to figure out using logic, trying to figure out the truth of a matter and so forth. So I think that I know this is just a very superficial covering of events, but just the idea that what we call detective work has been going on for a very long time, and that the because I think in one Father Brown story, he talks about how in some places in the Middle Ages there was a widespread belief that if the killer put his hands on a dead body, the wounds would the body he'd killed, the wounds would start flowing blood. And of course, Father Brown didn't think there was anything to that at all, but it's the case where he's just trying to bring out the real logic, detection, and what we call police work have been going on for centuries and centuries, even millennia. And I think we need to just try to, even though there's so many advances, we need to jettison the notion that detection is strictly a modern phenomenon of the last 200-300 years.
Yeah, I hadn't thought of it that way, that the donation of Constantine being exposed, yeah, by a priest, actually, as a style of detection in a way. And yeah, Judge Dee was a historical figure, but like a mythologized one. That to this day, they're still kind of telling stories about him and making movies about him, using his role as a civil servant to investigate crimes using logic. Yeah, I lived in China for a bit, and I remember enjoying the Judge Dee stories there. So if mystery stories have a root that's kind of deep in history and even cross-civilizationally, is there anything about maybe the ancient worldview or the medieval worldview or the Christian worldview that makes the detective story more appealing or like draws people to it? Or is it just that people in general like to solve a puzzle and people like detective stories for the same reason that they like, I guess, Sudoku or crossword puzzles or something?
Well, I think there are as many different reasons why people like something as you can, the infinite number. I think everybody brings their own to it. I think in traditional whodunits, a lot of people like to see a good triumphing over evil or order being restored. The idea of the bad guy getting caught, the idea of the innocent being cleared, and everything essentially returning back to normal, so to speak, or at least something or at least, as I said, the danger being removed from society. So there is the idea of that people will come together and prevent innocent people from being harmed, and in many ways, some people say this isn't realistic. They talk more of the Oscar Wilde dictum and the importance of being earnest, how the good end happily and the bad end unhappily. That is what is meant by fiction. But it's a case, but really, every society in the world has had to deal with crime in one way or another. It can be anything from outside bandits to the violence in different ways, and just the idea of how does one restore order? Do you have someone in charge who can arbitrate or figure out what happened? Because I mean, in many societies, we don't have too much on whether it was an official police force or any kind of investigator who might be able to explain what was going on somehow, or the idea, was there any forensic science and so forth. So, but I mean, throughout all these cultures, we have all these details on how murder is being punished, or how it makes you wonder how they figure out in some cases you needed witnesses and so forth. So it's again, when you look at the universality of it, every society has had problems. And when you look at ancient Greece and Rome, when a whole lot of the problems had to do with outside forces or with wars and battles, so much of the literature is about war and dealing just the idea of what it meant to be a good citizen, to keep the polis or the city state safe. But when you go on to talking about again just the an internal problems, crime, and you think about it, I mean, I think there's a book, I believe it's called something like The Victorian Way of Murder or something like that, exploring just how crime started to become a fixation in some ways during that time, as there were more and more attempts to study it scientifically, and everything from famous poisoning cases to Jack the Ripper set people's minds on fire. It's like we have all these issues, how are we going to solve them? Because I think, like, when we look at what we call the golden age of detective story that really started in the early 20th century, a lot of people are very, say, like, why did this genre come about? And a lot of people who are dismissive of mysteries will say it was escapism. It appealed to the lowest common denominators. But when you think about it, it was a reaction to a very serious problem going on, especially you look in going through 19th century England, early 20th century England, and that is the problem of unsolved crime. The most famous is, of course, Jack the Ripper. Is someone who killed at least 4 women, maybe more. It all depends on who you ask, but there are only 4 canonical victims by most ripperologists now. The idea of someone could commit these horrible, gory, violent crimes and then never be called to account for it. And this, shadow hanging over all this time. Will he ever return? What was he doing? Did he stop? Is he alive? Dead? And that made the specter of this incredibly destructive figure all the more powerful in the public imagination. But there are other cases, and one, I think, the Charles Bravo case. If any of you are anybody's familiar with that, it's this famous case where this one man basically was poisoned with antimony, I believe, which is very similar to arsenic in the way it works. But he died of poisoning, and no one ever figured out for sure who did it. But as Agatha Christie brings this up in at least 2 of her novels, because the murder was never solved, that meant the lives of all the people who were suspected were essentially ruined. And this was in 1876. Bravo dies, and his wife is main suspect. Her doctor who was there, who had a relationship with the wife at one point, he is the main suspect. His career is dashed by that. And Mrs. Cox, who was Mrs. Bravo's loyal companion, she was became the a suspect for all her life as well. And people would also think, well, maybe it was a suicide. And but says, why would you poison yourself with the most one of the most painful drugs you can find? So, but it was a case where no one knew. It was able to come to a conclusion who did it, and all these people have tried to come up with solutions over the years. And just like with the Jack the Ripper case, no one's ever been convinced all the way. But the idea of but people realize 1876, the police couldn't solve the murder themselves. No one could figure it out who did it. With you talk about at least 4 main suspects, the ones I mentioned, and possible others as well. So it became a parlor game trying to figure out who did it, and suddenly this becomes for people in the Victorian era who were terrified of scandal. This was everybody's worst fear. This could happen to you. That somebody if someone decided to kill someone else, or if someone decided to commit suicide by poisoning and didn't leave a note or anything, that meant that the shadow of suspicion could fall on you and anybody you cared about, anybody in your circle, your family, your friends, and it would never be lifted unless someday they could get a solution, any solution. Otherwise, everybody would be looking at you funny all your life. And it said, "Would you like to come to my house for dinner?" And people would go, "No," if there was a poisoning. And I think that's that's the point. The idea that Agatha Christie, Ordeal by Innocence, keeps making the point that's not the guilty who matter; it's the innocent. That was Ordeal by Innocence is cited as one of Christie's own favorites of her own novels. And you see that in a number of her other books. And I think that if you know the mystery novel has always been criticized for the amateur detective or even outside unofficial, from Sherlock Holmes to Miss Marple and Father Brown. The idea that what Chesterton points out that the detective story is about the only story where the officials are often held in lower regard, the professionals are held in lower regard than the amateur. But I think that's what happened is when during the 19th century, I just named two of the most famous cases, but there were all these cases where either it was never solved or there was later evidence that an innocent person was charged and possibly executed or at least jailed for a while. So I think that the idea, a whole lot of popular culture stems from worries that people have. And I think that some people, again, when you talk about the Victorian way of murder, that book indicates that there was some a lurid interest in murder and mystery and detection. But when you look at it, I think that this was, in some ways, it was a wish fulfillment. The idea that there is a figure who is out there who can make everything right when others can't put it together. The idea that, there's someone who can come in and essentially be a savior figure. And I think that's one of the reasons that Sherlock Holmes became such an popular force, because you have this man who is, he can do he does all these things the official police doesn't. He's able to investigate all these impossible situations. And the idea that if you're in terrible trouble, if you fear for your life, your reputation, come to 221B Baker Street and you can get the help you need. I hope I haven't been rambling too much, but again, this is something I think about a lot.
Yeah, for sure, Matt, and it kind of a lot of ideas in my mind what you were thinking. I'll just mention a few things and then I'll let you ask the question. I'm just gonna say a few things out loud so they can percolate in everybody's mind. But what you were saying reminded me a bit of the Levitical rituals of like kind of removing ritual impurity. Like we were just discussing this on our last episode actually about the red heifer and cutting open the one bird and dipping the other bird in its blood and letting the blood the bird fly away, kind of carrying the impurity, or literally the scapegoat in Leviticus 16, the goat for Azazel, like kind of carries the impurity outside of the camp. And that idea that like that's sort of what's happening here is an interesting idea. There's because in the ancient world, the fear maybe is the enemy, the external threat, so you want a military, but the horrifying thing about the mystery story, and in some ways the regressive thing you could say about the mystery story, is that the call is coming from inside the house, right? Like, and you get this in some of the Sherlock Holmes stories and Christie stories where, oh, it's that suspicious immigrant everyone thinks is the villain, and then the detective shows, no, actually it's the innocuous butler, or it's the brother, like the person who was part of the community all along was actually the cause of it. But by identifying them, I guess that kind of expunges that. And like you said, what a line. It's not the innocent, it's not the guilty that matter, but the innocent. It's like the vindication of the innocent, the restoration of order. W.H. Auden, of course, has his essay, The Guilty Vicarage, where I'll probably draw on this more later, but he does talk about why he loves detective stories, because they're a myth. Like when you were talking about escapism, I was thinking of myth, and a myth about the restoration. So the Garden of Eden, the guilty vicarage, right? The whole vicarage is guilty right now, in a sense, because you don't know who did it, right? And the detective plays a kind of priestly role in is restoring that order, restoring that harmony. And even in some sense, I know we've talked about this at one point, about the idea that in some sense the execution of a criminal is their forgiveness. Whatever that might mean. I mean, it's, in some sense restoring the whole harmony, the whole justice of everything. But of course, that would bring back the priestly aspect of even the Levitical priesthood there. But yeah, that mythological aspect of it. Those are the few. So I was wondering in some way that there isn't something eschatological about the detective story, this kind of image of like at one point the books will be open and the guilty will be punished.
Ooh,
right. And Chrissy mentioned the idea of the detective as kind of a savior figure. Yeah, I mean that of course I mean, Sherlock Holmes is the preeminent example. Sherlock Holmes, who literally fights with Professor Moriarty on the waterfall, and falls into it, and then 3 years later comes back. Of course, the story is he didn't actually fall into the waterfall, but symbolically, he actually threw Moriarty in and, pretended he was dead, but symbolically, dying and coming back 3 years later at Easter time. I don't know, lots of thoughts there, just percolating in my mind, but I saw you taking notes too. Did you have anything you wanted to?
Well, just to run with that a little bit, I mean, we've covered quite a spectrum there, from cross-examination to digging up the truth of the matter, which will shed light, right? Like the truth, it has this liberality, or I guess it sets us free in that sense, from the constraints of suspicion, or mentioning the shadow that would hover over all the society, within the polis or within the community, like who done it. So we need to investigate and bring forth truth, which goes hand in hand with justice. But hadn't thought, you had mentioned this too, about the ritual cleansing, almost the purgation element of it, and that's part we see going back to talking about the Torah there the other day, and it being blotting out from the book of life almost, right? So there's this erasure, but also of sin and purity. So there's that bit. But another thing that got me thinking there, and I don't know how this would square, but the role of the detective as savior, or some sort of, you mentioned priestly mechanism, but I'm thinking of Rene Girard and his scapegoat, because his argument is that the scapegoat with the figure of Christ takes on different proportions. Prior to that, you were required a sacrifice, right? So society's required essentially a murder in order to establish peace. Whereas after, so you'd create the scapegoat, who'd be a monster but a victim. Whereas now, post Christ, that veil is pulled back, and so the scapegoat doesn't work. The mechanism doesn't work the same way as it would prior to him. So the detective then is someone who is not involved in a murder, right? So not involved in the creation of a scapegoat, but rather the detective would be someone who could be involved in uncovering who created this havoc. So it's almost this post scapegoat role here, perhaps, that the detective would play in that mechanism. So you're, I guess, revealing, the revealing, it brings about a peace, and it reestablishes harmony in the revelation of truth. Which then brings us and lifts shadows at the same time. So innocent being cleared, mentioned order being restored, and danger being removed from society and so forth. So all this comes about through the mechanism of, or as abetted by the detective, right?
Well, that's something Auden mentions too, is that the detective story has a similar, he compares it to the Aristotelian definition of tragedy. Right, because in tragedy you have concealment and manifestation.
Right.
And tragedy you also have hamartia, right? You also have the fatal flaw.
And
I guess you could say that's actually, come to think of it, I guess that's true in the detective story, because that's the point of what the detective is trying to find. It looks like a perfect murder, right? But the detective identifies the flaw in the elaborate plot, or the flaw, the mistake that the murderer made.
Right.
And there's the concealment is undone, the manifestation happens, and that's what brings the catharsis, right, for Aristotle. And it's interesting, is that the role that the detective story plays for society, is like a collective catharsis, right? Because there are these unresolved things lingering in the air right now, the social injustices and so forth. And the detective story provides and again, not in a derogatory way, but the myth that this can be solved. Right?
Yes,
this order can be restored.
I guess here's another maybe question for Dr. Chan, but could you have a detective story where the crime isn't solved, right? I mean, I'm sure that they've been written, but are they?
Before he answers, I want to just clarify. Do you mean we, as the readers, aren't told who the killer is, or the characters in the book don't know, but we find out.
Oh, well, I mean,
That's different.
where the detective himself, I guess, fails to uncover the crime, right? Or
Okay.
whatever happens. I mean, I'm sure that's been written, but I guess there's something perhaps missing in the resolution, right? Like, I guess that maybe that wouldn't have sold as many copies, perhaps, or wouldn't bring a satisfaction.
Good thoughts. I want to hear,
Okay,
Dr. Chan, what do you think
yeah.
of that?
Well, I think I'm going to mention how and if you've read Martin Edwards, one of the leading British mystery writers today, wrote a book on the golden age of murder, and wrote a lot about in the Detection Club, the group of the original some of the leading mystery writers of their time in early 20th century England, and there were a number of authors right away who did write books like that. I think if Anthony Berkeley, who's written a number of cases where no one official finds out who committed the murder, although the reader gets to find out at the end.
That's why I wanted to distinguish, because there are
Yeah.
those where in the story the detective fails, but we
Right.
know what's really going on.
Right.
And so what do you,
Well, that would still bring some satisfaction to the reader, of course, because the reader then gets to circle,
but it makes the book tragic. I'm thinking
Right,
of
yeah.
The Burning Court, right, Chris? Where there's a spoilers, I guess. There's a resolution. The detective finds an answer, but we learn at the very end that in fact that's not at all what's going on. I'll just leave it
Oh,
at that.
okay,
And it's a very haunting. It's an incredible book actually, but it's a very haunting ending. So it doesn't have I guess there's a catharsis in a sense. There's a catharsis in that you as a reader are like, wow, that's a really well told story. But
Yeah.
it leaves you on, it's almost more like a thriller. You know how a lot of thriller or horror movies end you.
Right.
There's a catharsis, but you're left unsettled. And I guess that's part of the point. You leave,
Right.
what are both of your thoughts on that, I guess?
Speaking of thrilling endings, this is where part one of our discussion of detective stories comes to a halt, and not to leave you in a cliffhanger, but for those who are can't be left in suspense and are desiring that cathartic effect, fear not, part two awaits.